and thanks for staying with Bernama TV. Here are this hour's top stories. Zelensky and NATO's Rutte say they discussed US peace efforts in Odessa. Also, Chinese President Xi accorded state welcoming ceremony at Istana Negara. And in today's Point of View segment, I'll be speaking with an economist, Dr. GEOFFREY Williams, and he weighs in on the future of regional economic power in light of Chinese President Xi's visit to Malaysia. I'm Liz Song. You're watching The World on Bernama TV. We start Bernama World with this. 16 people have been arrested in Jordan over an alleged plot involving rockets and drones. The group was reportedly trained and funded in Lebanon with suspected links to the Muslim Brotherhood. One rocket was ready to launch and dozens more were found near the capital. Security forces also uncovered a secret factory. The suspects are now facing trial and their recorded confessions are expected to be broadcast in the coming days. In Lebanon, its Finance Minister Yassin Jaber announced that the country hopes to begin debt restructuring talks with international bondholders within the next year. However, no meetings are planned at next week's IMF and World Bank spring meetings. The government is focusing on economic reforms, including changes to the banking sector, tax systems and customs collection before starting talks. Lebanon defaulted on its $31 billion foreign debt in 2020. This will be the first IMF meeting attended by a Lebanese finance minister in over a decade. In other news, Syria's interim president Ahmad al-Shara arrived in Qatar on his first visit to the country. He was greeted at the airport by Qatar's Emir Tamim Al Thani before heading to the Amiri Diwan for talks with officials from both countries. Qatar has been a strong supporter of Syria's new government, having opposed former President Bashar al-Assad since the civil war began in 2011. On the front lines of the Ukraine-Russia war, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met in Odessa to discuss US peace efforts. Zelensky announced upcoming talks in Turkey involving Ukraine, the UK, France and Turkey on Black Sea security. He emphasized their focus is on post-ceasefire security guarantees, not ending the war. Zelensky also described ongoing US discussions about a minerals deal as positive, with further meetings expected.
Today we again spoke about the important talks that President Trump is leading with Ukraine as well as with Russia to try to end the war and secure a durable peace. These discussions are not easy, not least in the wake of this horrific violence. But we all support President Trump's push for peace. Other allies, including through efforts led by France and the United Kingdom, are ready, willing and able to shoulder more responsibility in helping to secure peace when the time comes.
Moving on, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for stronger cooperation between China and Malaysia, aiming to align their development strategies and deepen their bilateral ties. In an article published ahead of his state visit, Xi emphasizes the importance of mutual political trust and the Belt and Road Initiative. He also highlighted China's ongoing role as Malaysia's largest trading partner. Xi's visit to Malaysia is part of the broader Southeast Asia tour. In response, Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim has praised Chinese President Xi Jinping's vision for development, which highlights the importance of cultural, human and civilization progress alongside economic growth. In an interview, Dato Sri Anwar noted that Xi's idea aligned with Malaysia's Malaysia Madani framework, which focuses on values-based governance and humanitarianism. Dato Sri Anwar emphasized the importance of maintaining a humanistic spirit in discussions, particularly in the context of promoting dialogue between Islamic and Confucian civilizations. Chinese President Xi Jinping arrived in Malaysia yesterday for a three-day state visit, his second in 12 years. He was welcomed by Prime Minister Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim and other officials at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The visit includes meetings with Malaysia's King Sultan Ibrahim and bilateral talks with Datuk Seri Anwar. It highlights 50 years of diplomatic ties and aims to strengthen trade, cooperation and ASEAN-China relations, with China as Malaysia's top trading partner. And today, Chinese President Xi Jinping was officially welcomed at Istana Negara as part of his three-day state visit to Malaysia. He was received by King Sultan Ibrahim, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim and senior officials. The ceremony included a 21-gun salute, a guard of honor and cultural performances. Xi met with Sultan Ibrahim and attended a souvenir exchange ceremony. A state banquet and official dinner hosted by the King and Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim are also planned. Xi will later hold talks with Datuk Seri Anwar. I'm off to a break, and when I come back, I'll be speaking with Dr. Geoffrey Williams. He'll share his perspective on President Xi's visit and the future of regional economic power. This is The World on Bernama TV. Welcome back with me, Melissa Ong. As Chinese President Xi Jinping embarks on a significant diplomatic tour of Southeast Asia, including visits to Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia, the region finds itself at the nexus of evolving global trade dynamics. Malaysia, serving as the current ASEAN chair, plays a pivotal role in navigating these complexities. Now, to provide insights into the economic implications of these developments, we are joined by Dr. Geoffrey Williams, an esteemed economist and founder and director of Williams Business Consultancy, Sundram Berhad. Hello, Doctor. Thank you for joining us. President Xi's visit highlights China's renewed commitment to Southeast Asia. How significant is this visit, and what does it mean for Malaysia as the ASEAN chair? We'll start with this.
Okay, well, it is an extremely significant visit, and it would be under any circumstances. But of course, under the current circumstances, particularly with the US trade, US tariff issues, it has taken on a greater significance. I think it's important to understand that this visit is not as a direct consequence or direct response to what's going on with the tariff issue with the US. It is actually part of a long-term relationship that Malaysia has with China, which is extremely good. Malaysia has a very good relationship in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and in terms of diplomatic and political links. And since Malaysia at the moment is the chair of ASEAN, it's perfectly natural that President Xi should be here. But of course, people will perhaps think that it's a little more significant because of the US tariff issues. Nonetheless, I think that most of the discussions will be based on those long-term relationships. How can Malaysia build its long-term trade and investment ties with China? And also, how can Malaysia use its position as the chair of ASEAN to build long-term investment and trade relations with China and the ASEAN region as a whole?
Now, Doctor, with China's increasing investments in Malaysia, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, how can Malaysia ensure these projects are economically sustainable?
It's very important. It's a very important development program, the Belt and Road Initiative, and Prime Minister Anwar has pointed that out. You know, when he's talking about President Xi's vision on development, at the core of that is the Belt and Road process. And that is aiming to build closer relationships through trade and through investment. And as you said, it is important that these trade and investment relations are sustainable. There are risks to it. I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have very significant Chinese investment, but just recently we have an issue with our steelworks, which was owned by a Chinese company, and that has proved not to be sustainable. So there are risks associated with trade and investment through any form at all, actually, but particularly when you have very significant trade and investment through the Belt and Road Initiative. The way to try to ensure that this is sustainable is to ensure a very significant level of Malaysian contribution and involvement in these investment programs from the beginning, and to also make sure that these investment programs are built on a very, very strong foundation of mutual trust and respect, where expectations of all parties are known in advance and agreed in advance, so that through the implementation program, any difficulties will not come as shocks. There will always be difficulties during implementation processes, but these should not come as shocks. And if there is a very good relationship based on a mutual understanding of each other's aims and respect for each other's approaches, that's how you build the foundations for sustainable long-term growth and sustainable long-term projects from a Belt and Road Initiatives type approach.
Right. And Malaysia is currently exempted from some US tariffs, but according to economists, there are foreseeable challenges. How should Malaysian policymakers balance between maintaining trade ties with both the US and China, given the rising geopolitical tensions?
I think the most important thing to understand from a policy perspective is that Malaysia's relationship with China is a very long-term relationship. And although there are these short-term issues with tariffs with the US, nonetheless, the tariffs are to do with the United States. They're not necessarily to do with Malaysia's relationship with China over the long term. Of course, there will be implications if the Chinese economy slows down because of very heavy penalizing tariffs that the Americans have introduced. That will reduce demand in China, and it will reduce global demand, and that will have an effect on Malaysia. But actually, these types of issues are things that can be dealt with through a resilient long-term relationship. So it's very important to understand that the relationship between Malaysia and China is a long-term relationship. And that long-term relationship can withstand any short-term disruption that we might be seeing, for example, through the tariff issue. In the meantime, Malaysia needs to focus on the 90-day moratorium period that the US has put in place on the implementation of tariffs, and try as far as possible to provide a negotiated outcome which will reduce or even remove the reciprocal tariffs. And that might be very good for Malaysia, because, for example, if we're looking at questions of semiconductors or rare earth products, Malaysia is a natural second market for that outside of China. And so high tariffs in China might cause people to look to Malaysia to buy those products in the short term. That would be positive for Malaysia.
And Doctor, with global uncertainty, do you believe Malaysia is adequately diversified in its export base and also trade partnership? And where should Malaysia look next?
I think that quite naturally, because of the regional proximity with China, Malaysia has focused on the Chinese market. It's a huge market. It's a very dynamic and growing market. And Malaysian businesses can find very good sales in those markets. So it's quite natural that they should focus on that. The same is true also of the United States. It's the largest market in the world, and the type of products, particularly in electrical, electronics, semiconductors, that Malaysia is producing, they find a natural home in the United States. However, Malaysia has, over the course of the last 2 years, particularly under the unity government, been trying to diversify and find new export markets, and that has proved to be relatively successful. It's never a short-term thing. You can't quickly start selling or stop selling from one market and immediately sell into another market, but you have to begin that process. And I think that the foundation for that trade diversification is well underway, and Malaysia will be looking to new markets. And I think that those markets will be in OIC countries, they will be in other parts of Asia, perhaps in India, into the Middle East, for example, even into some of the European countries. There's a new FTA, for example, with the EFTA countries that's just been announced. So any of these places where people want to buy Malaysian products are available for Malaysian businesses. And therefore, it's very important for Malaysian businesses to try to think about alternative places to sell their products.
Now, some argue that the shift of Chinese production into ASEAN is an opportunity for regional growth. Do you see this relocation as a lasting trend or perhaps a temporary workaround to US tariffs?
Well, I think it is part of a long-term trend. And particularly in the ASEAN context, particularly if you look at places such as Cambodia and Vietnam, there has been a very large amount of Chinese investment, and that has included the relocation of Chinese production into those two countries in particular. Malaysia has also benefited in part from some of that. But if that becomes a point of sensitivity in terms of the tariff negotiations in the short term, then perhaps that sensitivity might be put off a little bit into the longer term. It may well be that the tariff issue becomes important in terms of relocating Chinese production into parts of ASEAN or into Malaysia. But I think that we need to look at that as a long-term trend. It is positive for ASEAN growth in the long term. And if there are short-term sensitivities, then perhaps just delaying a little bit and putting it off a year or two might be a better strategy.
Well, that's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on the show, Doctor. Have a good day. I'm off to another quick break. We'll be back with more updates. This is The World on Bernama TV. Welcome back to Bernama World with me, Melissa Ong. A remote control bomb has killed 3 police officers and injured 18 others in Pakistan's Balochistan province. The blast struck a police truck in Mastong district as it was travelling from Kalat to Quetta. The vehicle was carrying personnel from the Balochistan Constabulary. Those injured were taken to Bolan Medical College Hospital, and so far, no group has claimed responsibility. Meanwhile, multiple prisons in France have been attacked overnight as part of what officials believe is backlash against the crackdown on drug trafficking. In Tolan, gunmen fired automatic weapons at a prison. Cars were torched outside other facilities and staff were threatened. No injuries were reported. Authorities are investigating whether the attacks were coordinated. France's anti-terrorism unit is now leading the probe, with intelligence services brought in to support the investigation. In the United States, a shooting at a high school in Dallas, Texas, brought a large emergency response to the scene on Tuesday. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles were seen outside Wilmer Hutchins High School. Local reports say a 17-year-old student was shot in the lower leg. He was treated at the scene and is expected to recover. In other news, U.S. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. urged doctors to understand how to treat measles, not just rely on the vaccine. His remarks came as the U.S. faces an outbreak with over 600 cases across 6 states. Kennedy, who has a history of opposing vaccines, now supports vaccination but has faced criticism for making misleading statements about the treatments. Expert warns that confusion over these statements is hindering efforts to control the rise in measles cases. Still in the U.S., a 5.2 magnitude earthquake struck San Diego County, California on Monday, the U.S. Geological Survey reported. The quake, which occurred at a depth of 13.4 kilometers, was centered near Julian, a mountain town in eastern San Diego County. While no damage or injuries have been reported, locals described the shaking as intense and prolonged. Store owner Sandra Slaughter Moretti said the aftershocks were also strong, while others, including Morgan Alvarado, rushed outside for safety as the tremors hit. Shaking was felt across San Diego and Los Angeles counties. Now in Iraq, a sandstorm hit parts of Basra on Monday night, reducing visibility. Drivers navigated through thick fog, with some pulling over to the side of the road. The Basra Health Directorate reported that 1,041 people were hospitalized due to suffocation. At Basra Hospital, emergency areas were crowded with people wearing face masks and using nebulizers. Iraq is the 5th most vulnerable country to the climate crises, with drought and extreme heat making much of the country uninhabitable during summer months. We move on to sports. Swiss climber Nicolas Hojak and Austrian partner Philipp Brugger have broken a 21-year-old record for completing the North Faces at the Eiger, Mensch and Jungfrau. They completed the challenging ascent in just 15 hours and 30 minutes, nearly 10 hours faster than the previous record. They began their climb at 1 a.m. and reached Eiger in under 6 hours, a time that usually takes amateur climbers a full day or more.
Super.
Now to wrap things up, Lionel Messi and his Inter Miami teammates made the dreams of 23 children with critical illnesses come true on Tuesday at their home stadium in Fort Lauderdale. The children, along with their families, traveled from across the U.S. to meet the team, including Messi, Luis Suarez, Jordi Alba, and Sergio Busquets. The event celebrated World Wish Month, leading up to World Wish Day on April 29, honoring the work of Make-A-Wish. That's a wrap for this hour's broadcast. Don't forget to visit Bernama.com and follow us on our social media channels, YouTube, X, Instagram and Facebook for the latest news. You can also receive updates from Bernama Radio at 93.9 FM. This has been A World on Bernama TV. I'm Melissa Ong. Thanks for watching.